Some of the most popular coffee brands are not worth it anymore, and most people don't even notice it. Starbucks Pike Place Roast is one of those coffees you've probably seen everywhere, and because of the brand alone, people expect something above average, something a little more refined than what you'd normally get from a regular grocery store coffee. And to be fair, when you open the bag, it does feel like it's going to deliver exactly that. The aroma is smooth, balanced, and inviting. It gives you that impression of consistency, like you're about to drink something reliable, something well put together. But when you actually start drinking it regularly, not juste once, but over a few days, that's where things begin to change. Because what feels good at first starts to feel a bit too predictable. The flavor is smooth, yes, very easy to drink, but also very controlled, very safe. And that's the key point here. It doesn't challenge anything. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't give you that moment where you stop and notice something interesting in the cup. And for a lot of people, that's where the disconnect starts. Because when you're paying more for coffee, you're not just paying for something that's drinkable. You're expecting something that feels a little more complete, a little more present, something that gives you the sense that you made a good choice. But here, what you get is something that just blends into the background. It works, it's consistent, but it doesn't really reward you for choosing it. And once you start noticing that, it becomes harder to ignore, especially when you realize that there are other coffees, often at a lower price, that manage to deliver more flavor, more body, and a more noticeable experience without making things more complicated. And that's where this starts to feel less like a good choice and more like a habit. And habits are exactly what keep people buying it, not necessarily the quality itself. Now, the next one is different, because this one doesn't rely on a premium image. It relies on being simple, clean, and reliable. And that's exactly what makes people trust it. Green Mountain Breakfast Blend is one of those coffees that people often choose when they want something easy, something they don't have to think about. It's positioned as a smooth, approachable option, something that works in the morning without being too strong or too heavy. And that sounds good, especially for people who don't want anything intense. But when you actually start paying attention to what you're getting in the cup, that's where things begin to feel a bit off, because it's very mild, very soft, and in many cases, it ends up feeling a little too thin. There's not much body, not much structure, and not enough character to hold your attention. And at first, you might not notice it, especially if you're used to lighter coffees. But over time, it starts to feel like something is missing, like the experience is incomplete, and that's where the expectation starts to break. Because people assume that a clean and smooth coffee still needs to have some presence, some identity, something that makes it feel intentional. But here, it leans so much toward being easy that it ends up losing personality, and that's a problem. Especially when you consider how many alternatives exist in the same category. Because today, you can find coffees that are just as smooth, just as easy to drink, but still offer more flavor, more body, and a more satisfying overall experience. And once you try those, this one starts to feel a bit underwhelming. Not because it's bad, but because it doesn't really give you a reason to choose it over something else. And that's the key difference. It's not about being undrinkable. It's about not standing out in a way that justifies the choice. And the next one starts to make this even more obvious. Seattle's Best Level 3 is one of those coffees that sounds like a safe choice the moment you see it. The name suggests balance. The Level 3 gives this idea of something right in the middle. Not too strong, not too light. Something that should work for almost everyone. And that positioning alone already creates a certain expectation. People assume it's going to be reliable, easy, and consistent. And in a way, it is. But when you actually start drinking it regularly, that's where things begin to feel a bit off, because that balance often turns into something a little too neutral. The flavor is there, but it doesn't leave much of an impression. It's smooth, it goes down easy, but there's no moment where you really notice anything interesting happening. No depth that keeps your attention. No character that makes you look forward to the next cup. And that's where the issue starts to show, because a coffee that tries to please everyone often ends up not standing out for anyone. And that becomes more noticeable over time. especially when you compare it to other coffees in the same price range, because there are options that manage to be just as smooth, but still deliver a bit more presence, a bit more structure, something that makes the experience feel more complete. And once you notice that difference, this one starts to feel like a safe choice, but not necessarily a good one. And that's an important distinction, because people often confuse consistency with quality. But those two things are not always the same. And in this case, consistency just means it stays the same every time, even if that same is not particularly memorable, and once that clicks, it changes how you see it the next time you're deciding what to buy. Now the next one takes this in a slightly different direction, because this is a brand that built its reputation on being dependable, something that people could rely on without thinking too much about it. And for a long time, that worked very well. Maxwell House Original Roast is one of those coffees that feels familiar the moment you see it. It has that long-standing presence, something people recognize instantly. And because of that, there's a sense of trust attached to it. People assume it's going to deliver a consistent, no surprises kind of experience. And in many ways, it does exactly that. But when you look at it in today's context, that's where things begin to shift. Because what used to feel dependable now starts to feel a bit basic. The flavor is very straightforward, very flat. There's not much variation, not much depth, and not much that really holds your attention beyond the first few sips. And years ago, that was enough. Because the expectations were different, the options were more limited, and people weren't comparing as much as they do today. But now, with so many alternatives available at similar prices, that same profile starts to feel like it hasn't really kept up. And that's where the gap becomes noticeable, because people are no longer just looking for something that works. They're looking for something that feels worth it, something that gives them a reason to keep choosing it over everything else on the shelf. And in this case, that reason is not very clear anymore. It's not that the coffee is bad. It's still drinkable, still consistent, still familiar, but it doesn't offer anything that makes it stand out in a meaningful way. And once you realize that, it becomes easier to see why people start looking for alternatives. Not because they're chasing something premium, but simply because they want something that feels like a better choice for the same money. And the next one is where this becomes even more obvious, because this is probably one of the most recognizable names out there. Folgers Classic Roast is one of those coffees that almost everyone recognizes. It's been around for decades. It's part of a lot of people's routine, and for many, it's simply what coffee is supposed to taste like. And that familiarity creates a strong sense of trust. People don't really question it. They don't compare it. They just keep buying it because it's always been there. But when you actually look at it from today's perspective, that's where things start to shift. Because the experience it delivers doesn't really match what's available now. The flavor is very flat, very one-dimensional. There's not much depth, not much variation, and not much that keeps your attention after the first few sips. It does the basic job. It gives you something warm, something drinkable. But that's about it. And years ago, that was enough, because the options were limited and expectations were different. But today, that's where the gap becomes much more noticeable. Because now, you have access to a wide range of coffees at the same price point that offer a more complete experience. More body, more flavor, and a more satisfying overall profile without making things more complicated. And once you start trying those alternatives, it becomes very hard to go back. Not because this one is terrible, but because it feels like it hasn't evolved. It stayed the same while everything around it improved. And that's where it stops being a good default choice and starts becoming something people buy out of habit rather than preference. And that's really what this comes down to. Not saying these coffees are bad, but showing that the way they present themselves doesn't always match what you get when you actually drink them. And once you start paying attention to that, you begin to notice it more often. Not just with coffee, but with a lot of everyday products. Because sometimes, what keeps people buying something isn't the experience itself, it's the familiarity. And those are two very different things. So the next time you pick up a coffee that feels like a safe choice, it might be worth taking a second look, not at the brand, not at the name, but at what you're actually getting in the cup. Because sometimes the ones people trust the most are not the ones that give you the best experience anymore. And now, I'm curious about you. Have you ever tried a coffee that you expected to be better, but it didn't quite deliver? Let me know in the comments, because that's where you start to see how different people experience the same coffee in completely different ways. And if you enjoy this kind of content, simple and honest breakdowns of everyday coffee, make Suriyure subscribe, because there's a lot more like this coming. And in the next video, we're going to look at the opposite side of this. Coffees that are actually worth buying, even when people don't expect much from them.